And that. There's an event in Australia, an ultramarathon, and it's known as one of the most grueling running races in the world. It's 875 kilometers long, and it usually takes about 5 days for the top young professional runners to finish it. But in 1983, at the start of the race, there was a guest who showed up who was not expected to be running at all. His name was Cliff Young. And the reason why people thought he was a spectator or a volunteer at first is because he showed up wearing overalls and gumboots. And he was 61 years old. Now, older people can run marathons, but this person being not dressed for it seemed like they weren't the right person to be running the race. He was such a shocking sight at registration that he got interviewed by the press beforehand, and this is what his response was of why he's able to run this race. He says, "See, I grew up on a farm where we couldn't afford horses or four-wheel drives, and the whole time I was growing up until about 4 years ago when we finally made some money and got a four-wheeler, whenever the storms would roll in, I'd have to go out and round up the sheep. We had 2,000 head and we have 2,000 acres. Sometimes I'd have to run those sheep for 2 or 3 days. It took a long time, but I'd catch them. I believe I can run this race. It's only 2 more days, 5 days. I've run sheep for 3. So they let him sign up. And as the race began, he became more of a surprise because as the starts kick off, all these young professional runners who've trained year-round for this take off. And there's Cliff Young way at the back, slowly losing kilometers behind them. And he doesn't have like the most natural running posture. It is like a shuffling gait in his gumboots and overalls. Now, the approach of this race was down to a science of how one would survive such a grueling race. It was you run for 18 hours, and then you sleep for 6. Run for 18, sleep for 6. So that's what the pattern was for all the people leading the pack. Well, no one told Cliff that. So he ran continuously, 24 hours a day. And while the runners who were in the lead took their 6 hours to sleep, he would slowly make up some kilometers behind them, negating sleep for the entire race. Then on the 4th day, and it's usually around 5 days to finish the race, on the 4th day, during the final sleep of the lead pack of runners, he passed them while they were sleeping and kept going. And when they awoke, they had no idea that he had gone past them, and he finished 10 hours ahead of the second place finish. Yeah. Probably had worn through his gumboots by then. His victory was sensational and surprising, and no one expected him to finish, let alone come in first. And some of the greatest victories are ones that seem insurmountable. And that's why they catch our attention. You know, the underdog sports team that rises above and becomes the champion, or the person who's born without hands and they become a masterful painter. Or the person who has suffered being a child being abandoned and abused, and as an adult becomes empathetic and a motivational speaker. And those are superstar highlights of victory that we see on social media, we read on the news, or we see an inspiring video of. But what about experiencing victory in your daily life? The victory of maybe sticking to those commitments you made. Or the victory of getting the job that you hope for. Or the victory of feeling like the issues that follow you around, you are able to brush off and rise above. What about experiencing victory in your daily life? We're in a sermon series called Joshua, Victory in the New. We are in a new season of our church life. We are in our new building, and maybe you are newer to our church family as well. The book of Joshua is a book in the Old Testament that tells the story of the people of God coming to the land that was promised to them and beginning to enter it for the first time. And as they come into it, we over the last few weeks, we covered how they come up to the Jordan River, and God does a miracle, and he stops the Jordan River at flood stage, about 2 miles across, and the people of God walk across the dry land, over 1 million people, maybe 2 million, as they enter into the land for the first time. And then they set up physical markers or reminders, 2 piles of stones to remind them for future generations what God has done. They have one on the shore and then one actually in the middle of the river. And now they've entered, and we think, great, they've arrived. But it's one life-threatening hurdle after another as they enter. You see, they are looking for a victory that's way beyond themselves as they come into the land. They are now facing military outposts. And they themselves are not a trained army. They have been a nomadic people group for 40 years in the wilderness. And now they come up to what's known as Jericho, the first military outpost. And as they come up to it, something surprising and amazing happens before they engage with this location. This is in verse 13. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Joshua has been established as the leader of God's people. He is a man who's also a target. And suddenly there is a person standing near him with a sword drawn, someone he doesn't recognize. Probably wondering, are you an assassin sent in from Jericho? Are you one of my own people who's been paid off and is rising up against me? Who are you? But Joshua faces this stranger and walks up to him directly and boldly asks where he stands. And this is the response, and it's very clarifying. "Neither," he replied, "but as a commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. So we find out this person with the sword drawn is from God, and scholars wonder if it's an angel or maybe it's God himself. We don't know. But what is clear is that God is not subservient to Joshua and Joshua's leadership. See, Joshua comes to this person with the assumption that God is pro-Israel and anti-Canaanite, the people living in this land, which is not the case, as we've seen in chapter 2, is that God accepts any Canaanites who turn to him. Rahab and her family, and later in Joshua, the tribe called the Gibeonites turn to God, and they are saved as well. But by the angel or the mysterious figure stating that he's on neither side, it flips the question, back to Joshua. Are you on the Lord's side? Will you follow God's leading in the challenges ahead where you look for victory against overwhelming odds? So Joshua gets clarified that God is leading, and God's leading is much larger than Joshua's own personal leadership and agenda. That the victory doesn't rest upon Joshua and Joshua's leading, but on Joshua's following and who he is following. When I was 23 and I was looking for pastoral work, I felt very discouraged because I spent about a year looking for employment in a church. I was looking at job boards, church websites, everywhere, posting that I could find. One church I applied for in the Lower Mainland, they decided to interview me. I came to the interview, and there was a semicircle of chairs, the search committee and some of the board members. And I came into the room, and right away I noticed that my chair, the designated one for me, was about 4 inches shorter than all of theirs. Yeah. So I did the interview. I didn't get the job. I came up short. But a friend of mine did, and bless him, he's still there and doing great, so that's fantastic. And then I applied to Hammond Bay Church, but through a very strange way. See, when I looked on the website, there was no phone number or email or way to contact the church. So we've come a ways, don't worry. But if I held my mouse cursor over an image on the website, someone's personal email popped up. And I thought, okay, I'll send them my resume. So I sent them my resume, and they had edited the website decades ago, didn't know how their email was attached to it. And then I waited. And what I didn't know till years later is that Hammond Bay Church often didn't get resumes or applications out of the blue. But in that month that I applied, that 1 month, they received a total of 4 applications, probably all from hovering the mouse over the picture. And the leadership of the Hammond Bay Church at the time paid attention. They talked, they prayed, they asked God and asked each other, maybe God is getting our attention here. And I'm very, very grateful that they followed his leading. Joshua is given this grand vision to remind him that it's not just him in charge, that he must follow the Lord's leading if there's going to be victory. And this event, this person standing in front of Joshua and the conversation that they have around taking off your shoes for where you're standing is holy because God is meeting you here. It's an echo of his predecessors where Moses was at the burning bush and was commanded, take off your shoes because here is holy ground. And then from here we move to the first humanly impossible obstacle that they face, Jericho, a fortified military outpost that stands in the way of them entering to the promised land. And if they just try and skirt around it, they will have an enemy at their back the entire time. So this is where we take it up in chapter 6 where it says this. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. 7 was the number of perfection. God created the earth in 7 days and so on. It goes on and says, when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Now, even if you're familiar with the story and you've read it before, every time I read it, I want to go, wow, this is really weird. It's weird, and it's also brilliant. See, if Joshua had come up with this strategy on his own and said, hey, everybody, we're going to do this plan of marching around the city and then the wall will come down. If he'd come up with it, again, Joshua and the people of God would have gone back to this posture mindset of look how good and brilliant we are. Look how capable we are. We've got this. We can do this all on our own. Sure, God can handle the natural things like parting the river, that he can manage that for us at the Jordan River, but we have the strategic military planning on our own brilliance. Do we really need God's help? And that kind of posture and mindset is why it took so long for the people of God to follow the Lord's leading in the first place into the promised land, why they wandered in the desert and the wilderness for 40 years. In an earlier passage in Deuteronomy, it describes why they wandered. It says this in Deuteronomy 8:2. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and to test you in order to know what is in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. And then once this humbling, this testing was done, they're entering the promised land, which they are now. And there was also this warning from years earlier written in Deuteronomy that says this, when you have eaten and are satisfied, when you're in the land and you're content, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws and his decrees that I am giving to you this day. Meaning don't just look to God when times are hard, but when times are good, continue to be thankful and look to him. It goes on, it says, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. So the people of God follow through on this command given to Joshua. They march in silence around the city 6 times. Archaeology thinks this city, this military outpost, might have looked something like this. And as they are marching around this, there is a battle to come. And this can feel jarring for us in the 21st century. We think of, Genesis 12, where God is calling Abraham, that the people from Abraham are going to be a blessing to the nations, and God will know God through this people. So why on earth is there a conquest that's happening here under Joshua's leadership? We touched on this previously, and it's important to keep reminding ourselves of it, but God had allowed 400 years of patience for the Canaanite tribes to change their ways. And why do they need to change their ways? A lot of the Canaanite culture is described in Leviticus 18, where they have destructive sexual behavior, they have injustice towards the poor, they have harmful ritual worship with body mutilation, along with the darkest practice of religious child sacrifice. So, as the people of God were coming into this land, where the locals were practicing the ugliest of worship and lifestyles, the Israelites would have been quickly corrupted by it all. Because it's not like the Israelites were morally amazing and the Canaanites were down here. God had reminded the Israelites in Deuteronomy this: it is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. So when these battle texts, that we read them, we'll always have some degree of jarring uncomfortability with it. What we can trust is that God is still patient, merciful, and will not turn a blind eye to evil forever. Pastor and scholar Tim Mackey summarizes this well. He says, the battles of the book of Joshua were not simply one ancient tribe using violence to displace another and then using God to underwrite their own territorial agenda. Rather, they were a part of God's plan to cleanse the land of evil practices that pushed back the dark spiritual powers that had enslaved the people of Canaan. So what is coming to bear is God dealing with the brokenness of human evil. And with that said, let's continue to read down in verse 15 where it says this. On the seventh day, they've walked 6 times, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Meaning, this isn't a plundering warfare. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. So this is a controlled entrance into this military outpost of Jericho. It's not going to be plundering warfare, and it's going to be surrendering the wealth to the Lord. Precious metals could not easily be destroyed, and some of them were probably used to craft pagan gods, so they're going to be separated out. It goes on and says, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her. Jarring, yes. But also there's something that unless we read the whole of Joshua and understand the aspects around how ancient battle texts were described, we will miss crucial components of this. There is, for example, the language that's used around different battles that take place in Joshua. There's, utterly destroyed, or left no survivors, or left none that breathed. So it sounds like genocide. But later in the book of Joshua, when the Israelites come back to some of these places, there are still Canaanites living in them. So what is going on is that the text has some hyperbolic language that was common in ancient texts around battles. It was this above and beyond language. And secondly, another aspect that's important to consider is that in Deuteronomy 7, it says a warning to the people of God that after they are taken in the land and they are living in it, do not intermarry with the Canaanites there. And, if someone is utterly destroyed, how do you have the problem of intermarrying with them, right? So it's not describing a genocide. So when reading these texts, they are jarring, and there is still principles that we can take from it as we read them. That we know that this is an isolated time in history, and that it is only through following God's leading do the Israelites experience victory. in our own lives, we like to know what the future is going to look like. We like to race ahead and have the 5, 10, 20-year plan mapped out, ready, and that's where we are going. And goals are good, dreams are great, plans are important, but following the Lord's leading is best. Your victory rests in God's leading and watching and learning what he is doing, what his character is like, what he is prompting to you, what you are sensing from his Spirit. Because it's not in your strength or your power or your own intellect that you experience victory. You think back to that runner, Cliff Young, that he did the seemingly impossible race and won at 61 years old in gumboots. But if we take into account the warnings of Deuteronomy that it is God who gives us the ability, then he alone is the one that is the source for credit. A pastor I looked up to when I was in high school named Dave Woods, he recently passed away. He was a very positive influence on me. He was one who passionately tried to follow the Lord's leading. And Dave was quite a character. Whenever he'd preach and he got to the word heaven in the Bible, he would accidentally say Edmonton. And then I know, Edmonton of all places. Anyway, there's one story that Dave told that stuck with me about following God's leading. See, Dave was wrestling. He was pastoring here in Nanaimo at the time, and he was wrestling with seeing God move and do things, and he was feeling defeated and discouraged. And he was praying by himself, and he sensed the Lord saying, "Get on the next bus." He thought, that's pretty weird. I'm confused by that, but I'll say yes, and I'll do that. So he goes outside, walks past his car, gets on the bus, and it is empty. And he sits and he waits, and he's starting to get frustrated. He's like, what am I doing here? Like, maybe I misread this. And so he sits on the bus for about 10, 15 minutes, and then it stops, and one passenger gets on. And remember, he's alone on the bus besides the driver. A woman gets on the bus. She walks down the aisle and sits right next to him. So he says hi. And the woman begins to open up, and she's been going through major struggles and was wanting someone to talk to. As the conversation flows, he tells her that he sensed God telling him to get on this bus, and this was why, this conversation, to share with her that God does care, does love her, and that love is found in the cross and the resurrection of Jesus, that Christ died for her sin and forgives her and invites her to live day by day in the power of his presence. That your victory rests in God's leading. When we think of the life of Jesus, by human standards, he should never have been known beyond the next generation. He was doing ministry in a backwater country under a very oppressive regime and empire. He had a whopping 12 followers at the time of his death, 11 because you take away one for betraying him. And it was through the apparent foolishness of surrendering his life to the Roman Empire and to the religious elites and dying on the cross, through all of that he conquered sin and death and invites us to follow his leading, to move forward in looking what he is doing in the now. And that is where we'll experience strength, courage, and victory. Your strength, your victory rests in his leading. I'm going to take some time to pray, and then we're going to take communion together today. Heavenly Father, I thank you for today. I thank you for the story of Joshua, where we get to see these incredible miracles taking place, and help us to wrestle through these difficult texts together, to study them further, to see where you're at work, and to trust you where we might not know what's happening in it. I pray, Lord, as we come today to take communion, that you